I still remember the day my entire life unraveled. It wasn't with a bang or a dramatic confrontation. It was with the soft click of our front door as I returned home early from a trip that never happened. My name is Ethan Mitchell. I'm 36 years old, and until 6 months ago, I thought I had everything figured out. For 8 years, Rebecca and I built what I believed was the perfect life in our modern Cherry Creek home in Denver. The backdrop of the Rocky Mountains framed what I thought was our shared dream: successful careers, weekend getaways, and the kind of relationship others envied. I'm a financial analyst at Ridgeline Commercial Properties, one of Denver's leading real estate firms. Rebecca is a marketing executive for Altitude Luxury Resorts. We met at a charity gala, married within a year, and weathered storms together, including a devastating miscarriage 5 years ago. That loss changed us, but I thought it had made us stronger. I was wrong about so many things. That Friday in February started like any other. The Colorado winter had dumped another 8 inches of snow overnight, but the sky was that impossible blue you only get at high altitude. I was packed and ready for a weekend fishing trip with my best friend Jason at his family's cabin near Grand Lake. Rebecca had been especially affectionate that morning, helping me pack my thermal gear, kissing me goodbye with what seemed like genuine care. "Go," she said. "You need the break. You've been working so hard." Her smile seemed so real, her touch so loving. How do people lie so convincingly? I wasn't even out of the city when Jason called. His son had spiked a fever of 103, and they were headed to the pediatrician. "I'm so sorry, man," he said, the disappointment in his voice matching my own. "Rain check for next weekend?" After the call, I sat in my SUV at a stoplight, watching snowflakes melt on the windshield. Instead of feeling frustrated, a spontaneous idea lifted my mood. I'd surprise Rebecca with her favorite sushi from Matsuhisa and that New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc she loved. Maybe we'd have an unexpected date night. I should have just kept driving to the mountains alone. The first thing that felt wrong was the unfamiliar black Audi parked 2 houses down, facing the wrong direction. Then the front door, unlocked, when Rebecca was religious about home security. But it was the laughter, her laughter flowing from the backyard, that made my stomach twist into a knot. I set the food and wine on the kitchen counter silently. Years later, I still can't explain why I didn't announce myself. Some primal instinct, perhaps. Through the kitchen window, I could see our heated patio, where Rebecca sat with 3 friends, wine glasses in hand, fire pit blazing against the winter chill. "He has no idea," she was saying, her voice carrying clearly through the thin glass. 3 years, and he's completely clueless. The women laughed, but I froze, becoming a statue in my own kitchen. "Cameron and I have it down to a science," Rebecca continued. "It's almost too easy. Ethan's so trusting it's actually boring sometimes." My world tilted on its axis as she mentioned a name I recognized. Cameron Walsh, creative director at Pinnacle Hospitality Group, one of their main competitors. We'd met at industry events. I'd shaken his hand, exchanged pleasantries. "Remember when Ethan's dad died last year?" Her voice dropped a register, almost proud. "I told him I had food poisoning the night before the funeral, so I couldn't go to the viewing. Poor baby made me homemade soup." She took a dramatic sip of wine. "Meanwhile, Cameron and I were at the Crawford Hotel. I literally went from his bed to sitting beside Ethan at his father's funeral." The women gasped, then dissolved into laughter again. One friend said something about that being cold, but Rebecca just shrugged. What can I say? The heart wants what it wants. My father's funeral. I remembered that night with perfect clarity. Dad's sudden heart attack at 65, the shock and grief that had hollowed me out. I'd spent that evening making Rebecca chicken soup from scratch, worried about her on top of my own grief, wanting to care for her. I'd kissed her forehead and told her to rest while I sat alone in our living room, writing my eulogy with shaking hands. And all that time, she'd been with him. I backed away from the window, legs numb, a high-pitched ringing in my ears. 8 years of marriage collapsed into dust. But instead of confronting her, instead of storming outside and creating a scene, I did something that surprised even me. I picked up the sushi and wine, walked out the door, and quietly pulled it closed behind me. In my car, I sat watching our house, her house, for nearly an hour, completely still, a cold clarity washing over me. When I finally started the engine, I knew exactly where I was going. If you've ever felt the ground disappear beneath your feet, if you've ever discovered that the person who was supposed to love you the most was capable of the cruelest betrayal, then you might understand what happened next. Jason didn't ask questions when I showed up at his door with sushi and wine, my face apparently telling him everything he needed to know. His son was already sleeping off his fever, and his wife Sarah took one look at me and discreetly disappeared upstairs. "Whatever it is," Jason said as we sat in his basement den, "I'm here." The words spilled out of me then, every detail of what I'd overheard. Jason, my college roommate, my best man, godfather to the children Rebecca and I never had, listened without interruption. When I mentioned my father's funeral, he closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the blow on my behalf. "What are you going to do?" he asked when I finally fell silent. That was the question, wasn't it? The expected script would have been confrontation, anger, a dramatic showdown, but something else was crystallizing inside me, something colder and more deliberate. "Nothing," I said. "At least, not yet." Jason looked concerned. "Ethan, you have to confront her." I shook my head. "She thinks I'm spineless, that I'd never figure it out, and if I did, I'd just fall apart." I looked up at him. "I'm going to show her how wrong she is." That night began what I now think of as my shadow life. I returned home late, telling Rebecca the fishing trip had been great, but I was exhausted. She kissed me and asked about the weekend with practiced interest. I answered with fabricated stories about catches and campfires while she nodded, her eyes occasionally drifting to her phone. How had I never noticed before? For the next 3 weeks, I became someone else. Someone calculating and patient. I played the role of oblivious husband perfectly while systematically gathering evidence. Jason, with his IT security background, helped me access our shared cloud accounts. There I found years of deleted text messages automatically backed up, hotel receipts, and intimate photos that burned into my memory. The most shattering discovery was a voice message from Rebecca to Cameron the weekend after our anniversary. We'd spent at a mountain lodge where I'd surprised her with a custom sapphire necklace that matched her eyes. In the message, she laughed about how, quote, pathetic my gift was, compared to the weekend they had planned. "Even if Ethan somehow found out," she said, "he's too spineless to do anything about it." That message became my North Star, not just evidence of betrayal, but a challenge I intended to answer. I moved money, consulted with Nora Blackwell, a divorce attorney friends called the Silencer, for her methodical, devastating approach, and prepared myself financially and legally. Through careful research, I even found Cameron's wife, Valerie, a pediatric nurse raising their 2 young children while he played pretend with my wife. Our coffee meeting at an obscure diner outside the city was brief but consequential. I silently handed her a USB drive with everything I'd found. She didn't cry as she reviewed it on her laptop. Like me, something had hardened inside her. "When?" she asked simply. 2 weeks, I replied. "The night before Rebecca's presentation to the altitude board for her promotion. 3 days before your anniversary," she nodded once, decisively. "I'll be ready." Have you ever known what it's like to live with someone who has destroyed your world? To smile at them over breakfast while planning their downfall? It's a special kind of hell, one I created for myself by choosing calculated revenge over immediate confrontation. Some nights, watching Rebecca sleep beside me, I wondered if I was becoming a monster. Other nights, remembering her laughter as she described being with him before my father's funeral, I felt nothing but ice in my veins. The night before Rebecca's career-defining presentation, I triggered the carefully constructed collapse of her professional reputation. With Jason's help, emails containing evidence of her affair with a competitor, including sensitive company information they had shared, went to her board members, her direct reports, and key clients. That same night, Valerie confronted Cameron and locked him out of their house. I came home late, claimed a work emergency, and kissed Rebecca's forehead, wishing her luck for tomorrow. "You're going to do amazing, honey," I said. "I'm so proud of you." She smiled, completely unaware that in 12 hours, her carefully constructed life would crumble. I wish I could tell you I felt triumph the next day. I didn't. As Rebecca called me hysterically from her office, explaining that someone had sabotaged her, that horrible rumors were spreading that her presentation had been canceled, I felt hollow. "Come home," I told her gently. "We'll figure it out together." When she walked through our front door 2 hours later, her mascara streaked down her face, I was sitting calmly in our living room. On the coffee table between us, divorce papers, printed evidence of her affair, and the sapphire necklace I'd given her for our anniversary. "I've known for almost a month," I said quietly. Her face? I'll never forget how her expression shifted from confusion to shock to a horrible understanding. "Ethan," she whispered, "you can't. This isn't." "Sit down, Rebecca." My voice remained calm, which seemed to terrify her more than if I'd shouted. "We have a lot to discuss." What followed was the most controlled conversation of my life. No yelling, no accusations, just facts, consequences, and terms. I laid out exactly what I knew, how long I'd known it, and what would happen next. The prenup she'd insisted on, intended to protect her higher salary, now worked against her after her documented infidelity. As I spoke, Rebecca cycled through denial, anger, bargaining, and finally a desperate, sobbing plea for forgiveness. "I made a terrible mistake," she cried. "We can fix this. We can get counseling." I looked at the woman I had loved for 8 years and felt nothing. "You weren't making a mistake when you were with him before my father's funeral," I said quietly. "You were showing me who you really are. I believe you now. If I'm being honest with you, and I'm trying to be," the look of devastation on her face did give me a moment of satisfaction. It was brief, but it was real. In that moment, I knew she finally understood what she had lost. For those dealing with betrayal, letting go isn't a single moment. It's a process that unfolds in layers. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than the most heated argument, and the most powerful response isn't an emotional outburst, but a calculated withdrawal. I'd like to know if you've experienced something similar. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to choose between confrontation and strategic silence. Our divorce was finalized in record time. Rebecca moved in with her sister across town. Cameron and Valerie entered a messy, public divorce battle that made local headlines when it came out that he had affairs with multiple colleagues. I bought a downtown loft with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out at the mountains. For weeks, Rebecca called, texted, and emailed, alternating between apologies, accusations that I had overreacted, and pleas to talk. I maintained my silence. At work, I accepted a promotion that had me traveling regularly to our Phoenix office, grateful for the distance. Slowly, I started rebuilding. I bought furniture that was nothing like what we'd had in our shared home. I tried new restaurants instead of our old favorites. I hiked trails we'd never explored together. 6 months passed, and the raw wound began to scab over. I wasn't dating yet, but I'd started noticing women again, their smiles, their laughter. One Saturday morning in late August, I was at a home improvement store buying supplies to build a bookshelf, something I'd always wanted to try, but Rebecca had discouraged. "Why build something that won't look as good as store-bought?" As I stood debating between different types of wood stain, I heard her voice. "Ethan." I turned to find Rebecca standing there, looking different. Her hair shorter, her usual polished appearance somewhat dimmed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "How are you?" she finally asked. I was surprised to discover I could answer honestly. "I'm doing well." She nodded, glancing at my cart. "Building something?" "A bookshelf. Probably won't be perfect, but it'll be mine." She smiled sadly at that. "I'm moving to Chicago next week," she said. "Fresh start." I nodded, unsure what to say. We stood awkwardly in the aisle as shoppers moved around us. "I've wanted to tell you something," she said finally. "I am sorry, Ethan. Not because I got caught or because of what happened after. I'm sorry because you deserve better than what I did. You are a good husband." For the first time, her words seemed to hold no agenda, no manipulation. "Thank you for saying that," I replied, surprising myself. As we said goodbye, I realized I felt no anger looking at her, just a distant sadness for what might have been. That night, I sat in my new home, the pieces of my unfinished bookshelf spread around me. On my laptop, I opened the folder where I'd stored all the evidence of Rebecca's betrayal, the texts, the photos, the receipts that had fueled my calculated revenge. After a moment's hesitation, I selected it all and hit delete. The revenge hadn't healed me. The methodical destruction hadn't filled the hole her betrayal had left. What was healing me was this: building something new, however imperfect. Creating a life that was authentically mine. If my story resonates with you, if you found yourself rebuilding after betrayal, I hope you'll share your experience in the comments. There's something powerful about knowing you're not alone in these darker moments of life. My bookshelf turned out decently in the end. The corners don't quite meet perfectly, and the stain is a bit uneven in places. But every time I look at it, I'm reminded that something honest, even with its flaws, is better than a perfect illusion. And if you want to hear more stories of how people found strength after betrayal, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from our most painful moments. As for me, I'm learning that peace doesn't come from making others pay for their mistakes. It comes from building something new from the broken pieces they left behind.